Women's CS historically has been a niche part of the community, with not many people putting respect on the scene. When you look back at the history of the scene, there was a valid argument for criticism early on.
She's grenaded herself. Oh my god!
Rounds were not complex, they were simple. There were not a lot of teams competing, which meant if you could somewhat aim, you'd be able to challenge for the first place prize at $25,000. And people looked upon this with scrutiny. In a timeline of 2018 to 2020, where you have Prime Astralis redefining the meta, creating an era of beautiful CS with intense methodology, precise grenade placement, and every single second in the round having a purpose, then you compare the two. It was like night and day. Bias then becomes created, and then opinion turns into a permanent overall view of the scene, which has stuck ever since. But this is not fair to the women's CS community in the present day. Women's CS has evolved so much over the last couple of years, and if you don't believe me, let's explore together.
Wonderful!
Oh! With the rare inspect cat and the one dig.
Chapter 1. Defining a scene to a default. Let's go on a journey together, all the way back to 2015. Here, the approach to Counter-Strike was a lot simpler. Teams relied heavily on default setups. Teams like BMG, who later became Team Secret, dominated the scene, not with complex tactics, but with pure firepower. Their game plans were default heavy, out of spawn, and then reacting to what happens during a round. It was less about theory and more about play your role and we will find a way to win. I want to show you a round to reflect this from Intel Challenger Katowice 2017 final between Dignitas and Team Secret. If you watch the CT setup from Team Secret and pay attention to the minimap, you'll see a stark contrast to what CS looks like today. The players are spotted outside by the AWP and there was no utility to help set up the sniper for a kill. Zaz starts in Secret to support the AWP, but the rest of the CT side are static. There's not a tug of war of map control. Vilga remains at ramp, and the players within the A site never push lobby, which is now a staple of CT aggression to fight for space. The T side are also playing together, just hunting in packs, looking to deathball into an area of the map to have favourable fights by having more players in the right spaces. But why did this happen? Why was the reliance so much on just defaulting? Well, back then, most players weren't backed by an organisation. CS was a second priority. After your 9-to-5 job, you'd hop on for whatever time you had left for practice. Teams that played more together naturally developed better chemistry, but the time commitment wasn't anywhere near what we see today. No one could focus on detailed strategies or hours of analysis. The idea of sitting down to analyze demos or craft counter strategies wasn't even on the table yet. Practice was largely just scrims. The teams who put in more hours had better coordination, but this wasn't due to an in-depth tactical preparation, it was pure repetition and instinct. If you had seen something in the scrim, then you know the reaction to take. Chapter 2. The Emergence of AWPers. Fast forward to 2022 and things started to shift. With the opportunity of ESL Impact, professional organisations began to enter the women's Counter-Strike scene, creating more opportunities for dedicated, full-time competition. It had been a while since we saw regular women's tournaments in Counter-Strike, and that meant that we still saw similar tendencies to fall back on as a failsafe. A good example of this was Nigma Galaxy. When ESL Impact launched, they crushed the competition. But why? It's because they played with a well-structured default. Their game wasn't just about aiming, it was about every player knowing their role, reacting according to set protocols, and dominating with superior teamwork. The mid-round understanding this team had was nothing like the scene had ever seen before, and the success quickly followed. They were one of the few teams able to fully dedicate themselves to the game because they were salaried, and it showed. But let's not forget, the AWP was still queen in this era. Having an elite AWPer could turn the tide of any match. When organisations began picking up women's teams, the scene shifted. Players now had the time and the resources to focus entirely on improving their game. This is when we saw the rise of structured defaults. Teams moved away from simply reacting to the round, they started building mid-round strategies based on solid map control. What you have to appreciate during this period is that whilst organisations were first dipping their toes back into the water, this created a new chapter for change. Something that would take time. You are creating and moulding a new meta within Counter-Strike's extensive history. It would make sense that due to tournaments only coming back, there would be a developmental period of other teams catching up. I say it on ESL Impact broadcasts regularly that the competition is getting exponentially better every single season. Chapter 3. Re-establishing the meta. And now we enter the modern era, the tactical era. The game has evolved to a point where individual firepower isn't enough. It's all about teamwork, strategy, and preparation, and it's becoming really fun to watch. With more organisations backing women's teams, the resources available are incredible. Players now have access to coaches, analysts, and even boot camps. This means practice is no longer just about scrimming. Teams are working on offline theory, reviewing demos, and refining their gameplay down to the smallest details. The prac days are intense, working 8 to 10 hours every single day towards their dream, becoming the best in the scene. Take NIP, for instance. With experienced coaches like NATO Safix on board, teams can dig deep into the fundamentals of Counter-Strike and work out tactical nuances that give them an edge. Coaches now play a pivotal role in shaping how teams approach each game. Another interesting development is how much the women's scene has started to mirror the men's meta. Conditioning plays, CT side setups, and round variations are now just as complex and varied as what we see in the highest levels of competitive CS. I want to show you an example of this. Big were putting constant pressure on middle on Ancient CT side, and this forced Imperial to address the problem of cave and mid control by fighting through B doors. By doing the same movements but with different timings on the utility and the pushes, Big will be able to create conditioning. This created the opportunity at the start of round 18 where 2 players pushed A main and punished the lurker, allowing Giuliano to flank into T-spawn and win the round for her team. The use of conditioning shows deep understanding of strategy, showing them being cognizant that each action will force a reaction from the opponent. It really is no wonder that nowadays, teams have started putting significant efforts into becoming unpredictable. Chapter 4. The future of the scene. So, what does the future hold for women's Counter-Strike? If the past 2 years are any indication, we're only scratching the surface. As more teams receive support from big organisations and more talent is discovered, the level of play will only get higher. This has been evidenced by the most recent event, the ESL Impact Season 6 Finals in Stockholm, and it was on Nuke, where Furia called a perfect T-side, setting down the outside smokes, but always feigning that there was more than one player down secret by throwing extra utility. They were then scaled to Garage, constantly caused doubt to Imperial. This made for uncomfortable rotations. It then evolved. Furia started calling a much slower mid-round to get a reaction from Imperial, holding for lobby aggression, and then sending players into ramp once the rotates again had been forced from the pressure outside. Imperial would eventually go on to win the series and cement their legacy even further within the women's Counter-Strike scene. They have now won 8 straight ESL Impact events, setting a new record for the history books. Furia would have their revenge 1 week later in Rio on LAN, where the two met for the last time at the end of the year, and I can't wait to see who will win the next best of 3. One area that still needs improvements, however, is the number of competitions available. Right now, ESL Impact is the only major tournament. With more frequent LANs and tournaments, teams could focus on long-term development, rather than rushing to make immediate roster changes to chase short-term success. This has begun to shift. With the new VRS rankings, it meant that Imperial was invited to Blast Bounty, where they look really competitive against Na'Vi, and are set to challenge Furia at the IEM Katowice play-ins. What's exciting is that the trajectory is clear. More resources, more players, and more tactical depth. The women's scene is poised to grow even more and start inspiring the next generation of players, allowing barriers to be broken, with more women becoming involved in the scene. If you see women role models, there's a much higher likelihood of you wanting to follow in the footsteps and compete yourself one day. Now that's a future we can all get behind.